When I was growing up, I began to imagine what it would be like when we had our first kid. You know the drill. The new parents treated like demigods, everybody high-fiving one another, and people passing around the baby like a Vince Lombardi trophy after the Super Bowl. But when my wife and I had our first child, it wasn't quite like that. Instead, it was more like this. Immediately after our son was taken away to be placed in an area called the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, commonly referred to as the NICU for short. In the NICU, only my wife, myself, and one other visitor were allowed to go in to see my son. The area was restricted, so there was very little sound other than the sound of medical equipment. The environment would go from calm to chaotic every hour, and everyone was always too busy to stop and engage. At the end of the day, I thought I was going to leave out of there with my son, but instead, at the end of the day, all I walked out with was PTSD. For those of you who don't know what PTSD is, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's when an individual has difficulty recovering from experiencing a terrifying event. I'm definitely not alone. 500,000 babies will be born this year and will be placed in the NICU like my son. Essentially, that means that 1,400 babies a day go into the NICU. That also means that 1,400 parents are going to find themselves in a NICU near you. The loss of a child is ranked as one of the most painful events that an adult can actually experience. Now, building a NICU app was originally my wife's idea. Right? I decided that I would just simply be moral and financial support. She asked me to constantly join her team, to which I would politely answer, no. Now, I know what you're thinking, worst husband award, but just hear me out. It wasn't that I was saying no to the idea. I was saying no to her, because she was the boss that I never wanted. And I was the employee that she never wanted. So I already knew where this was going. Word of advice, choose marriage first, folks, okay? But we didn't set out just to build an app, because, I mean, who wants another app? It wasn't about building another app. It was about building access. When we lost our son, we felt hurt, lost, hopeless, alone. We felt as though we had lost access to hope because we had lost access to knowledge and understanding during our time in the NICU. Let me take a minute to explain. In the NICU, the patients, the newborn babies, they're born too early. So all of the inner and outer bits and pieces that make us, they're still in the development phases. And what was once connected to the reliable systems of the mother are now connected to the systems and the digital systems of the NICU. Inside of the womb of a mother, the body of an infant is quietly formed and constantly monitored. While in the NICU, there are constant alarms and sounds for every change in the changing and development of that child. Instead of the warm caress of the mother's hand to her womb, there are nurses and doctors scrambling around trying to save lives. And while the mother is carrying her child in her womb under her protection, when that child is in the NICU, they're no longer under your protection. You're helpless as you stand and watch others attempt to do what your body was doing naturally. This is actually where the idea of the app came to fruition. The app has 3 phases of development that coincide with the 3 levels of connection that the parents, the medical providers, and the community partners all desperately need. Those 3 levels of connection are education, community, and medical. I want to spend some time with you today to talk about those 3 levels of connection. The first level of connection is education. 75% of parents who end up in the NICU have no idea that they're going to be there. That means that they're not going to be well prepared, they're not going to be well educated in medical terminology, and the extended family will not be on standby. My wife had great test results from the doctor just a week before she was administered into the hospital. We had books and journal articles and apps that told us what to do when the child came home, but we didn't have anything to tell us what to do when you couldn't take your child home. It became quite clear that we needed educational material that could explain procedures, identify the medical staff that was interacting with our child every day, and identify the equipment and procedures that were being carried out each and every single moment. I never mentioned this earlier, but I actually teach anatomy and physiology at a local college. So when my wife and I were in the NICU, she kind of referred to me as her personal Google. I also served on the Children's Development Council at that hospital. So, I had a few connections to some different people to get a few more answers than the average person. And even yet, we spent most of every day finding answers on our own, spending time alone, waiting for overwhelmed staff, lacking access to answers. When we did meet up with a doctor or get feedback from a nurse or find an answer online, it became the knowledge that we needed to help push us forward, to continue to fight. It was like as if access to information kept us connected to the reality of hope that existed outside of our reach while we were within the NICU. The second level of connection is community. The number of premature births are actually increasing, and the mortality rate of these premature babies and their birth mothers are increasing as well. This has created this complex community of individuals that typical and traditional resources just don't connect with. You see, when a baby is born without complications, they are embraced by their family, which is typically embraced by the larger community. But what about the parents and the grandparents who can't embrace their newborns? And how does the larger community embrace them? Within our app, we provided access to numerous community partners who provide understanding, resources, and support. Something that makes this component so necessary is the phase of the app that allows others outside of the NICU to connect with those who are in the NICU. When we were in the NICU, only my wife and myself and one visitor were allowed to visit the child. Now, this visitor had to be picked on the exact same day that my child first went into the NICU, and you couldn't change who this visitor was. So, because of that, our parents never had the chance to change my son's diaper like I did. Community resources provide those outside of the NICU insight into how different things are going to be for the parents inside of the NICU. It also tells them what to do when the lives of the parents are better, bad, and worse. People didn't know how to actually help us while we were in the NICU. As a matter of fact, we weren't the kind of people who really asked for help. As a matter of fact, we weren't the kind of people who asked for much of anything except for a child. One of the things that a community can do for a family when they're facing a time of crisis is to just provide a safe space. A couple of weeks after losing my son, I was in Washington, D.C., when a police officer pulled up beside me and asked me to wind down my window. I was a little confused, so he proceeded to ask me if I was okay. I said, yeah, but he told me that I had actually been sitting through the past 2 green lights and that I was currently sitting at my third. It was at that moment that I realized that I had checked out. At that time, I was looking for information and found it on PTSD for mothers, but I didn't find anything on PTSD for fathers. The third and final level of connection is medical, which connects the family and the healthcare providers so that they can feel like teammates during the process. Now, this level of connection is very personal to me on several different levels. You see, our child was delivered at a teaching hospital, which meant that periodically a faculty member would come in with a group of medical students in tow to observe very sick babies. I'd be sitting in my rocking chair reading to my son while he was in his incubator when a faculty member would bring in his or her students. But as they would surround my son, they would block me from access to my son while class was in session. So one day, out of sheer defiance, I placed my rocking chair right beside my son's incubator and blocked them. Our only interaction in that moment were glares of anger from me and glares of frustration from the young medical students. Many months later, I sat with a healthcare educator and we began to discuss the need for a platform where everybody could talk about the sacred without trespassing on sacred ground. Another reason for creating this phase is to give both the healthcare provider and the parents of a child a safe and secure way to discuss patient information. This can make a great impact on things because it can reduce medical mistakes that are actually harmful and costly. A Journal of American Medical Association of Pediatrics study showed that once you added family members to the process of reporting medical issues and medical errors, you could boost error reporting by 16%. Family members reported incidents that were otherwise neither detected nor documented, including preventable errors. Life is never the same after the loss of a child. We didn't just lose a child, we lost a promise. But by creating this app that allowed parents and healthcare providers and community partners to connect and communicate in one place, we felt like we created a solution that would prevent things like this from happening to other parents. You know, when you lose a child, you actually feel as though you've lost your purpose in life. You feel demoted, stripped of your rank, dishonorably discharged from parental service. You can't simply turn back the hand of time. I mean, you become an adult simply by turning 18, and no matter what you do, you can never turn back into an adolescent. However, when you become a parent, it's because you've had a child added to the equation. So what happens when that child is immediately removed from that equation? I am actually happy to say that my wife and I are in the process of adoption. Even though my wife and I played with the idea before, it wasn't really until moving forward that we heard a woman give a TED talk on adoption. That same lady that gave that TED talk on adoption has been personally walking us through the process and providing great support. We've met wonderful people who have taken us by the hand to walk us through the process, providing us constant information and clarity through every single step. Some of the people during the process have even walked the walk of loss, similar to my wife and I. For the first time in years, I'm intentionally looking at toys, researching names, looking at schools, planning our first beach trip. Great loss brought the need for a great app. But as far as great joy is concerned, I don't think we need an app for that. Thank you.